So his research interests are on physiological control of the generation and activation of TB and antigen presenting cells, all the information that you can get from the website. And a very interesting thing I noticed about Dr. Satyajit Rath is that he is interested in discussing the details, or the scientific attitude and the practice of science, and what it means to be a scientist in a social context, right? So that actually makes him particularly interesting for a session like ours today. And then Professor J. Devika is a historian and a social critic. She currently researches and teaches at the Center for Development Studies, Thiruvananthapuram, as a professor. She has contributed to the history of gender, development studies. I'm sorry, just a minute. I'm just trying to. History of Gender, Development, Politics and Culture of Modern Kerala. She's the author of Engendering Individuals, The Language of Reforming in 20th Century Kerala, published by Orion Longman. Then Woman Writing Equals Man Reading, ? Published by Penguin in 2013, and the co-author of New Lamps for Old, and several other publications. I'm not going to read out everything. Interestingly, she has actually translated works of Malayalam writers like K.R. Meera, Sarah Joseph, and memoirs of Nalini Jamila. So the next panel discussant is Dr. Firoz Hassan. He's an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur. He earned his PhD from the University of Michigan. He works on the history of film theory, politics of aesthetics, and world cinema. And I understand that he's broadly interested in questions of art. What does it mean to call something an art, and the connection between beauty and politics and so on. So we look forward to an interesting session with all these scholars. So I will just, so what we'll do is, we'll start. So this is the format I thought about, and we'll obviously this is going to be flexible and so on. So the thing is, but what I'll do is start with a basic question, a simple causal story associated with the virus, so it's just a virus that causes the disease, right? So that's a most reductive kind of picture, most reductive kind of account about the COVID-19 pandemic. So I will start with the scientist here, and then I will move on to the the social. So we can imagine that it's in a kind of the dialogue might proceed in the in the form of concentric circles, right? Expanding circles. So it start from the virus, and then we move on to society and community and so on, and then we address questions pertaining to different classes of people, and then we will move on to representation. It doesn't mean that any of these categories or any of these levels are more important than others. I mean, there's no hierarchy or superiority implied in this arrangement. It is just for the sake of simplicity. All right. So now I will just start with a simple question to Dr. Satyajit Rath. So what do you think about the basic causal role of the virus? Can you sort of enlighten us? Because we hear a lot of stories about about the nature of the virus, and how things have been coming to this point, right? Because right from 2000 onwards, roughly around that time, there have been different kinds of viruses, which human beings got from other animals and so on. And there are also fears that because of the evolutionary process, these viruses are mutating and they could become deadlier, and climate change could have an impact on it. So can you just give a scientist perspective? And we are also looking forward to actually getting a clear picture on it, rather than being led by a lot of news that's getting viral, and YouTube videos and so on. Thank you. Can you please unmute Dr. Satyajit? Please unmute.
So thank you very much. Clearly, I'm very much an outsider perspective here. But I've been finding yesterday's sessions extremely interesting and illuminating, and I hope to add my 2 bits to that. So let me start with the question that you raise, but let me make a sort of prefatory footnote, if I may, and that is that if we are going to discuss perspectives on the origins of disease, which is really what I suspect would be most appropriate, then it's pointless for me to waste your time in a disquisition about explaining the pandemic and the disease in purely medical terms. So while I'm not unwilling to do that, let me start out with how I see the ambit of the question that you've raised. So clearly, COVID-19, the disease, I hate to call it corona, because that's like identifying a whole family and holding it responsible for the deeds of one member of the family. So clearly COVID-19 as the disease is a result of infection by SARS-CoV-2, which is a member of the coronavirus family. And this is a member that most of us humans do not seem to have met before last year. I'm being very careful in how I phrase what I'm saying. So of course, a question of interest, both to the expert domain and to the lay domain from the perspective of biomedicine, is where did it come from? And a prevalent answer, which came up in, for me, very interestingly, in Professor Thornberg's keynote address yesterday, is that the virus of the current pandemic seems to have originated in a wet market in Wuhan, in China last year. And this is a simple and comforting story of origins. But in reality, that is neither actually likely to be correct, nor is it how infecting viruses arrive, if I may use the metaphor of journey, into a new host species. So in empirical terms, the virus was apparently present in all sorts of places in the Huanan seafood wholesale market, which is the market under discussion. It was present on door handles, on taps, and so on and so forth. And if it had arrived in the form of a singular origin story as one animal carrying the virus, then of course you wouldn't expect this kind of wide presence of the virus in all sorts of locations in the market. It's also true that while a fair proportion of the early COVID-19 sick individuals from very different places in Wuhan city had some connection to the market, many of them did not. In fact, it divides approximately half and half, or 60%, 40%, something like that. So the evidence does not hang together for a simple story of a singular origin of the virus. And that, I think, is interesting for all of us in a variety of ways, both in terms of the actual messiness of life and of our attempts to convert the messy realities into what Professor Dilip Menon called yesterday our dramaturgical imperatives of the narrative of an origin, a climax, a catharsis, and a closure. And from that point of view, it's interesting as well. What's more important for me is that this simple story of origins is actually not how biology happens in the ecosystem. The emergence of a microbe as a new infectious agent in a host species is a slow and gradual process of mutual familiarization, acclimatization, if I may use that term with all its resonances into climate change, with many accidental slips between multiple cups and many a lip, it's quite likely that the virus population, not the virus as a sort of imagined singular entity, but a growing population of virus that has its own divergences, is drifted back and forth between more than one host species by accidental infection and selection until landing on humans in essentially an aimless journey to nowhere. Clearly, bats and pangolins are likely to have been points in this accidental journey, although we can't quite locate their places in the journey yet. Even more importantly, the virus population is likely to have landed in humans more than once too, with many infection events not amounting to anything in the sense of not starting a chain of transmission until one finally did. And in this context, it's interesting that we tend to see, despite this messiness, the idea of contagion as a singular bolt from the blue. And there are odd and depressing associations of this idea as well that we might perhaps talk about. But let me make one final point connecting the animal origins of SARS-CoV-2 that our narrative incorporates with the ideas of environmental degradation and climate change as major fueling points for the emergence of this species crossover by the virus leading to a pandemic. It's been a point made, again, Professor Thornberg referred to this as well as many other people. And clearly, this is correct, of course, in that the increasing size of the human footprint on ecosystems, and the evocative image of a human footprint on ecosystems should not escape any of us. But that increasing size makes these transfers of infectious microbe strains between different host species more and more likely. But rather than talk about that, I would like to flag an odd omission that we make in this context. And that is the sheer scale and intensity of connectivity of the human socioeconomic world has been clearly a massive facilitator of this respiratory virus pandemic. And yet, I sometimes wonder if we've been talking more about our environmental footprint and less about our, shall I say, mutual footprint. And this is of particular interest to me because the shaping of this mutual social footprint, of course, owes a great deal to the many inequities of class. And as my final point in that, I point to the irony that the initial spread of the pandemic was made possible by the density of global business air travel, which of course is largely, though not wholly, one specific class. And yet the rapid spread of a respiratory virus in communities is facilitated by extreme urban crowding in communal living conditions, which of course involves a whole different class altogether. And this juxtaposition of what I'm calling the shaping of the human socioeconomic world and how that shaping has affected different stages of the expansion of this pandemic differently is perhaps not quite as addressed as I would dearly love it to be. Let me stop there, and we can take conversation.
Okay. Thank you. That's a very thoughtful and detailed answer. And also, let me just clarify. I didn't expect you to give a very medical and scientific perspective on that. I mean, scientific answer to that. I mean, you actually got it correctly. I mean, you said that it's a perspective that you need, and actually that's exactly what we got. So in fact, the way you concluded your discussion, or the way you concluded this point that you made just now, I mean, the current response that you gave, actually ideally leads to the social question. I mean, basically, it actually leads to the social question naturally, right? So we have been experiencing that, and Dr. Jayakumari, sorry, Professor Dr. Devika is the person whom I would like to ask next. So you have responded to this coronavirus situation, I mean, COVID-19 situation caused by coronavirus in many ways. I have actually read some of them also. So I would like to see, I would like to ask you how you respond to it as a social phenomenon, because it's some kind of unprecedented kind of occurrence, right, in our lifetime, and also in a long time, right? Please unmute Dr. Devika.
Before I get into that, I just want to point out that this is, I mean, taking off from Dr. Rath's response, I think this is the time when we really need to take the insights, a host of insights that have been generated in fields as distinct as maybe the sociology of science, to say social theory of theorists like Donna Haraway, right up to the insights of ecology and environmental psychology. It's time to integrate these discourses, and take those insights seriously. So therefore, I would say that, I mean, this, what you were proposing, start from science and then move in concentric circles, is perhaps not the kind metaphor we might need, because we cannot talk anymore of nature and culture as distinct. And you have to talk about nature cultures. And what is alarming for me is that it's not as if we did not notice this, even in the most local kind of situations, we have been seeing pandemics increase. I mean, the pandemic came now, but just take one example. Just take Kerala. Since the early, 2000, this new millennium, we have seen what all. We saw bird flu in 2004. We saw leptospirosis, dengue, chikungunya. All these were in expanding. You saw these expanding across districts. Again, what was evident was the erosion of the human natural interface. This has been happening. And then, of course, the Nipah. Every case we saw that the erosion of this interface between humans and nature was directly leading to mass, non-community diseases that were now threatening Kerala once again. But no one really thought, and of course, you have had writing from biologists and ecologists and many other environmental scholars, environmental studies scholars, warning of a global pandemic. But none of this was taken seriously. Somewhere, I think the insights of environmental psychology on why we deny, the effects of environmental destruction are perhaps relevant now more than at any other time before. That's one thing I would want to say. And the second thing, of course, I mean, I have been writing about other things as well. For example, on how we cannot avoid the question of public caregiving anymore. This is not going to be the last pandemic, we all know. In a society where immunity has been seriously compromised, with, I'm sure there's malnutrition, including in a place like Kerala, where incomes are better and so on, there is actually, lack of food, nutritious food. People are cutting down on meals. Even lower middle class people are cutting down on the number of meals they take. So which means that an immunity is likely to be compromised in the future. And women are probably going to take the brunt of it, which means that there's going to be another pandemic soon. And so public caregiving becomes, something that no state can afford to look away from. So I think these are the two things I think we need to really discuss. I mean, not this discussion, but in general. One is how as academics, I think we need to take seriously the interventions of people like Bruno Latour or Donna Haraway and many others. We need to reframe how we do social science completely. We have to really move past this whole division between nature and culture in the way we discuss society. That's one thing we need to desperately do. And on the other hand, when it comes to governance, I think the need for public caregiving has to be put right in front of the agenda. It has to appear on top of the agenda before anything else. So I think I'll stop for now and then.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Devika. So, thing is, it's very interesting. So, how you, in fact, made me realize the mistake of seeing that in as concentric circles. But again, I wanted to have a simple picture to work with.
Right, right.
So yeah, so then we have, obviously we can think of interconnections and networks and all that, and which actually, I mean, you clearly suggested Bruno Latour, right, who comes up with this networked approach, this nature cult. I mean, who basically actually talks about this laboratory life and how does a complex molecule get constructed, what kind of discussions go into the making of a molecule and so on. And he actually also studied the scientific community as an anthropological, I mean, as some kind of a tribe or something. So it's a very interesting analysis, and probably we have to actually bring that in perspective. In fact, many even in writing, non-fiction writing, we have come across such suggestions like from authors like Amitav Ghosh. In The Great Derangement, he actually brings up this point about nature culture and refers to Latour and Donna Haraway, if I remember. So that's a very interesting and pertinent point. And with that, now I'd like to move to Dr. Bindu Lakshmi, who's also a social scientist. So how do you see that, Dr. Bindu Lakshmi? Because you are in the in the Women's Studies program and in Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So how do you see this this whole situation of the COVID pandemic?
Thanks, Jobin. Am I audible?
Yes, you are very audible. Yeah. Very
okay.
Clear.
So first, let me begin with no. I don't know how I have come to label as medical humanities is something I'm trying to take a conscious decision not to call myself a medical humanities person, because we are still figuring out I am still trying to make sense of what medical humanities in the contemporary context in which we live. So let me come back to the question which you have posed, Jobin. This is something what I feel currently, the way our response to this pandemic, it has been often a historical. When I mean a historical, I really, what I meant was it is, we are responding to something very immediate context without looking at deeply hierarchically structured, when I say hierarchically structured, historically hierarchically structured society where inequalities are much more historical. So we haven't really responded to the pandemic in that sense. So I'm not going into the cause of this pandemic, which is your original question, where you also said that it looks like more reductive. However, I also like the concept which Professor Rath talked about, the mutual footprint. But I want to understand when we are talking about responding or understanding the pandemic from our immediate response in the sense that some of the mitigating strategies, what we have seen that the kind of lockdown that has come to our life, which has been not necessarily very well thought out lockdown, the way we responded in terms of physical distancing without looking into the context in which people live in a country like ours. So what I've seen here also, some way very starkly, the paradox of public health ethics and biomedical ethics gets contradicted. So we need to have much more clear understanding about how does it operate, because the moment we see pandemic, we are responding to a public health emergency. The public health emergency then seems to me the way we responded without looking at histories of inequalities that has been embedded through across caste, class, sexualities, genders, the way we try to look at it. And then that is also trying to, as a person who is still trying to make sense of medical humanities, I would like to understand then how do we then look at public health ethics in our context, or trying to understand, and its paradox with biomedical ethics, where we think about an individual and society, particularly its connection with the connection with medicine. So it is, when we see that, you also try to, I'm also trying to understand how did it particularly affected. Come to think of this, let me try to begin with this simple story. This young woman, Neelam Kumari in Ghaziabad, who lost her life. She was in full labor, and she went around some 8 hospitals in a span of 15 hours in order to get medical health access. It seems the hospital was scared of COVID-19 pandemic and did not admit her, and she lost her life on our way. When I'm trying to articulate the public health ethics, how do we try to respond to that? We have seen that all non-essential services, the so-called, how do we understand non-essential services in the context of medical, in the context of health is also something very important. We have seen that all of that has been disrupted during the pandemic. And we are talking about this is at the same time, the state is also saying that, no, we would try to provide essential services. We have seen people lost their lives, migrants traveling, across, and many of them lost their lives on their way without getting access to services. So our response to this pandemic as something as immediate and urgent, without looking at the historical context of inequalities, extremely problematic. So I want to come back to that question when we think about particularly pandemic and how do we unpack medicine and society, the relationship between medicine and society, and how do we unpack that relationship. Let us have much more clarity on how do we articulate a public health crisis, COVID-19, that has come in front of us, which is much more historical, but our response was often ahistorical to it. So I want to, impinge on, there are a lot of examples to give, particularly in the context of disability care. How do we then articulate an ethics of care? That I can come back to that a little later after, if there is a time.
Definitely, we have time to come back to it, and we have to address these questions like disability and mental health and so on. So we'll definitely, that's the next step. And thanks for pointing out this point about histories of inequality. And also, sorry for labeling you as a medical humanities expert. I mean, it was actually how I understood, your in description, the way the description that was given of you. So
websites are often misleading, Jobin.
So basically, and also the thing is, very often and in fact, this is actually a problem that we might have to come back to later on. This problem of labeling, like how do you understand science, or how do you understand a person as some kind of an activist, or maybe something like a feminist or anything like that. So labeling actually blurs the problem. In fact, actually, it's an escape route from a detailed engagement with the issue, right? We just label people or certain topics, and then we try to get away from that. So I understand that point. And then now we will move to Dr. Feroz Hassan. So I can't see him on the screen. So yeah, okay, he's here. So Dr. Feroz Hassan, so we have all been affected by this, and as a person who studies art, like art forms and so on, like visual art, and the kind of changes you may have observed, some kind of changes that are happening in response to this COVID pandemic. And generally, how do you see the problem? And what are the trends that you notice with regard to the topics that you study in relation to the outbreak of COVID-19?
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Jobin. Yeah, I think I'll just build on some of the remarks that have been made already. I think Professor Devika had spoken about the need to think about the nature-culture interface. And it turns out that the nature-culture interface is generally thought of in a particular way. It is narrativized. And narrativized not just in fictional writing or in fictional filmmaking, but narrativized in public discourse. And often that narrative tends to be, as Dr. Rath said, a comforting narrative, in the sense that it is thought of as an outbreak narrative with a specific point of origin that can then be followed through a sort of a detective story format in order to chart its movement and therefore sort of ultimately domesticate it. Okay? And then that's the end of it. And then we move on. Okay? And we see that both literature and cinema have amplified this kind of narrativization. I don't think narrativization is a problem, but a certain kind of a classical detective narrative format structure could be the problem over here. Okay. And in particular, some of the films that have been a part of discussion recently sort of follow this structure so closely as to ultimately reveal the exact point of origin of the contagion. Okay, I mean, if you think of the film Contagion itself, it ends with Gwyneth Paltrow's character shaking hands with a chef who has just treated a pig, some pork that has come from a particular farm that we have seen before that. Okay, and so does the Malayalam film Virus. It also ends with that image of exactly the point where the contagion was passed on. And this problem seems to be that moment of contact between nature and humans, that seems to become a problem. Okay? Suggesting that contact had not been there before. So I think these are some of the aspects of public discourse. And I think scholars have pointed out that these are not narrative structures that have been contributed necessarily by fiction. These are narrative structures that have risen out of public discourse about contagion, which have then been built upon by literature and cinema. So I think that is one aspect that certainly stands out at the moment. And then we can sort of talk more about it as we go on.
Okay, good, thank you. And actually, you have touched upon a very interesting point in terms of narrativization. That reminds me of something that Dilip Menon said yesterday. So when you have a curve that is associated with epidemics, right, like something like an inverted U shape or something, he said that it is not an analysis or an explanation, but it is just if I remember right, it's a kind of representation of the problem. So we are actually not, not really understanding the phenomenon, but we are just like giving an account of it in some sense, giving a narrative of it in some sense. So, so a pictorial narrative, so to say. So that actually takes me to Dr. Rath. This problem of science and medicine, that's this medical science and politics, that question comes in a big way in this context, So when we have these pictures like this, of the epidemic curve and so on, and this attempt to talk about the spread of an epidemic in natural science terms, I also want to invoke Dr. Dilip Menon's talk yesterday, where he said that there are really no natural laws at work, perhaps, So, but if there were natural laws, I mean, would it be wrong to think that the state would like it if there were some natural laws? So you can actually, make things a lot, let's say something like treat things maybe to put it in a simple way, things become more manageable that way, So what's your response to that? I don't know if I phrased it well, but. Yeah.
So I was wondering when we were going to get to the elephant in the room, of course, which is politics. For me, that's a crucial component. Many of my colleagues in the natural sciences would prefer not to think about this. But for me, it remains an absolutely crucial component. So let me take two examples of state responses, the Indian state, but also states across the world, state responses to the pandemic, to underline what I'm going to try and say in response. One is the idea of lockdowns as public policy. And the other is the idea of herd immunity as an achievable policy goal. Both are fundamental fallacies even from a purely mechanistic natural science understanding. And yet, both are presented to us along the trajectory, as Professor Hassan said, of a linear detective story narrative as, oh, this is how we will get somewhere good. And yet, both represent for me a political convergence, a convergence between an exclusionary nativist politics on the one hand and a neoliberal consumer capitalism on the other hand. I think that the idea of herd immunity as a goal, rather than simply a retrospective outcome, is a category error presented as an achievable goal. And I think that the idea that lockdowns will actually make us victors in the war and will get the virus to disappear is a sort of epic fantasy for those who follow the genre, is an epic fantasy of a piece with Friedmanian fantasies of the perfect free market. Both are unachievable in the messy, complex realities of life, and yet those are what we treat as substitutes. And in both of these, it is worth asking the question, cui bono? Who benefits from the state committing itself to what I'm calling exclusionary policies that are not even based on rigorous mechanistic understanding? It's worth asking who benefits and who does not.
Okay. So is that, are you stopping now, or are you?
Well, I'm going to stop now because I'm actually finding the other panelists much more interesting.
Okay.
Than
All right. Fine. That's great. So that's good. So now that actually opens up to the questions of exclusion and inequality. What are the narratives that are not heard, and so on. So, but just before that, I just wanted to make a point to all the viewers. Please post your comments on the chat box. So we'll spend some 10 to 15 minutes discussing your questions, 15 minutes for discussing your questions. So please, I would like to have questions from the audience. So please post the questions on the chat box. Now we will move to, to come back to Dr. Rath. So the question of exclusion and, the question of missing narratives, perhaps, if I may take one point away from that, so how do you actually think about that, Dr. Devika? Please unmute.
I was actually thinking this when I was listening to both Bindu and Dr. Satyajit Rath. I personally have been living in a kind of time confusion as a historian. I mean, the time confusion has happened even before. In fact, the whole period from 2014 onwards, I think I have been living in a kind of time confusion, in the sense that I really don't know if we are living in a colonial society once again. I mean, if you look at the nature of the state, I mean, I teach economic history, and therefore I cannot help noticing this, because only a colonial state could have imposed such terrible suffering on people. If you think about demonetization, for example, only the colonial state did this, that by frequently changing monetary policy to the betterment of the colonizer. Only a colonial state could do that, to not think about the mass of Indians. And therefore, in colonialism, we have so many stories of, overnight pauperism and so on. And that kind of experience, suddenly we were jolted into that kind of experience with demonetization. But then now, during the pandemic, just watching the suffering, the terrible suffering of people, you cannot help wondering if you're back under colonialism again, you know, because you actually, this is a situation where, and in fact, the insight of the newer economic history, which puts its finger not on colonialism alone, but on the local elites. I mean, there is economic history, the newer versions of economic history get out of this binary framing of nationalist versus colonialist. They try to look at other agents who were responsible. And in looking at late Mughal, for example, there is excellent work that actually points out to the role of the surplus extracting local elites, how local elites actually extracted a larger part of the surplus compared to the state. And so the great expansion of trade in the late Mughal period did not benefit the poor, did not benefit India at all, did not improve the standards of people at all. Likewise, one is thinking of now, because now we are not living under colonialism, we all know. But why is it we have this uncanny presence, almost eerie kind of presence of colonialism all around us? The experience of colonialism seems to be haunting us, coming back. And it's actually coming back. That kind of power is coming back through our elites. So this is something that the pandemic has kind of opened our eyes to. This is one thing. The other thing is, I want to take off on what Dr. Rath was talking about in his first response. You think about the colonial period again. Pandemics in India have always, the epidemics in India always spread well through precisely the kind of channels that Dr. Rath has been talking about, increased interaction among people. So, for example, cholera in India was already known before the colonial period. It was already known in riverine Bengal. But by the time the Maratha armies, the British armies which fought the Marathas, took it to Maharashtra, the strain had become much more virulent. So the kind of really virulent cholera that we see now in India actually has a whole history of traveling with the East India Company's armies from Eastern India to Western India. So these are all experiences we all know about all this. The great tragedy is that none of these insights seem to inform any kind of intervention. They not only, of course, the elites in India don't care about all these things, but as far as policymakers are concerned, none of this is central to the kind of responses that they are trying to forge to this to the current crisis. So, in some ways, we need to really think through the ghostly presence of colonial suffering, colonial power and colonial suffering at a time in which I don't think nationalism has ever been, the nationalist discourse has been used with so much militancy ever, not even during the during the nationalist struggle. You could still have someone like Tagore, who was not nationalist, but he could be regarded as a national figure and a source of inspiration for the building of the nation. Now you have a situation where nationalism is everywhere. It's the most militant kind of discourse ever. Yet we have the ghostly presence of colonialism, in every part of our life, from the state to civil society. It's just colonialism is everywhere. It's important for us, I think, to explore why that happens.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Devika, you mentioned earlier that women bear the brunt.
Yes.
Obviously you made some very interesting points about that, and then now you actually made the connection between, how this spread of cholera in colonial times is kind of similar to the spread of this COVID epidemic because of this global business travel, as Dr. Rath put it, right? So all those things are there, but I want to specifically explore this question of the problems of women in this in these times. So can you give us a perspective on that?
Now, women are affected in both as caregivers and as patients. So again, you have a history here. Now think about the Kala Azar. The Kala Azar, which basically originated in Assam in the tea plantations. It was already there in the Garo Hills, and the narrowing of the human natural interface in the Garo Hills for tea plantations, when forests were cut down for tree plantations, that gave an environment for sandflies to breed. So the vector breeding became much more intense, and that's what caused Kala Azar. And the workers who fell ill, the Bihari workers, people from Chota Nagpur in Bihar who had migrated to Assam to work in the tree plantations, when they fell ill, they came back. And these were mostly men. When they came back, they gave the disease to the women in the houses. In fact, basically their families. And these women, they were more immune compromised because, tea plantation work, that money is very, very little. In fact, the employers in the Assam plantations were able to hire people for such low wages only because the families back home, in Bihar, etc., the subsistence of those families were taken care of by the labor of those women at home. So these women bore the entire weight of family subsistence. The husband, whatever the husband's earnings, whatever little, went into repaying the debt, whatever debts. The debts of debt was a perennial reality under colonialism, coming back now. Again, another ghostly presence of colonialism in the lives of the Indian poor. So these women were immune compromised, heavily immune compromised. So the Kala Azar affected the women much more than the men. And of course, they had much less resources, and the men, of course, were prioritized. Given the fact that we have a patriarchal social arrangement in place then and now, the women are much more likely to be immune compromised. So, besides the problems that Bindu was highlighting, non-access to services for pregnant women and so on, this is a reality. This is one thing. The other thing is women's role as caregivers, as public caregivers. Now, the best example in India, the Kudumbashree in Kerala is highly lauded for being. But then public caregiving is a lot of hard work with little pay, very little remuneration. So in India, for example, in Kerala, for example, Kudumbashree women have been drafted as cleaners in the public COVID facilities, but still paid very low. So in Trivandrum, for example, they were trying to recruit these women. And they, of course, were scared for their own lives, so they refused. And then the Kudumbashree used the helpline called Snehita, which is generally used for counseling women in distress, to convince these women to enter this system as the lowest paid caregivers. So, again, we have a history, remember, in the influenza epidemic, for example, globally, especially in Europe, the ones who died in the influenza epidemic were all American nurses, black American women who were recruited into the US Army as nurses. They are the ones who died most. So you see, as caregivers and as patients, women take a back seat.
Yes.
So that's really, that is the crisis. And I think we need to see this both, because usually we do not look at the caregivers.
Okay. So thank you. That's that actually connects to this, the systemic inequality and problems, and the kind of violence that healthcare workers, especially women, have been facing. I want to come back to Dr. Bindu Lakshmi's point about the histories of inequality. And I know that you have been exploring questions of disability and mental health and so on. So what are the challenges for such groups in these testing times?
Yeah, so Jobin, before going into that specifically, I would also want to take on from where Dr. Rath and Devika ended. One question which very precisely Professor Rath asked: who benefits from state exclusionary policies? Come to, and it is connected to your larger question where you are talking about specifically when you try to look at marginal identities. come to think of the way neoliberalism entered in our lives, particularly in healthcare system, and because it has again a larger history, if you come to think of, just for example, if you imagine our population policy, how neoliberalism came in a particular language of development, for example, and we know that how invasive contraceptives come to our life and various other things. But come to think of it, neoliberalism also brought in a particular way of understanding and articulating consumer subject and a consumer citizen in that sense. It will ideally become a good citizen who would engage into certain work which is appropriate to the moralistic order of the society. I want to connect it very specifically with what's happening with the pandemic. If you know that, no, I don't know whether you are aware of this particular study which emerged from Harvard and Yale Medical School, a couple of researchers from there, where they proposed modeling the effect of continued closure of red light area on COVID-19. This study has a lot of methodological flaws for the to begin with, and particularly the sex workers movement in India. They have responded to this study, saying the problems specifically with the study like that. In fact, the study in the context of COVID-19, which recommended closing down the red light areas, and it should be redeveloped by private agencies. And this is one of the recommendations of the study. The red light areas should be redeveloped by private agencies and also relocating sex workers. It is very precisely how state neoliberalism and research, the nexus operates in the current context. And it's very difficult. And very beautifully, the sex workers movement and concerned academics in India particularly responded to this study, saying that, come to think of sex work in India, it coexists with a range of other work which where marginal communities are engaged in. And particularly trying to articulate red light area is something specific. We know that it is indistinguishable from the larger urban slums, for example. And the idea of proposing that kind of study, which comes from researchers and particularly from the medical model, medical researchers, is extremely, it is scary, it is problematic, and it is connecting to the question about states' exclusionary policies. And in fact, this study group actually made a recommendation to the state of West Bengal, saying that they have to close down the Sonagachi area, and come to think of it, how people coexist with varieties of work. And this is again connected to what Devika is also talking about. The way we try to see, there are certain kind of ideologies which comes in. On the one hand, we are going back to the extremes of colonialist articulation, but at the same time, certain kind of moralistic order which comes through this idea of nationalism, which comes in our lives. So what is very interesting in this context would be, let us come to understand particularly the COVID-19 lockdown that has also happened in our country when we are dealing with a lot of other issues, particularly an aggressive militaristic nationalist attitude of the of a state. We have been in the protest, there have been Shaheen Bagh happening, there are other kind of protest people on the street, and all of that has been sidelined with this pandemic narrative on the other hand. At one level we have become all nationalist, on the other hand we are also regressive, following the rule and become ideal good citizens. So this paradox is extremely problematic to look at, and I'm trying to make the connection between the two. And the other thing, the specific question which you are asking, Jobin, which I want to respond to it, in the way we are, our response to the pandemic, the way we have articulated lockdown, it has invisibilized identities, particularly, that's what I'm talking about, healthcare access to persons living with disabilities. It is not something, we cannot understand the relationship only in a dependent way. And again, that is also connected with the Devika's articulation of care. Care ethics that is articulated by feminist ethics of care. It is also an idea of mutuality, the idea of interdependence, which Carol Gilligan, feminist philosopher Carol Gilligan and others have articulated the notion of feminist care ethics. Our response to the pandemic, the narrative of pandemic, which attempted to look at marginal identities of course, no, there are no, the ways in which essential service has been disrupted, and there is no access to medical care, particularly people living with no support systems, elderly care, etc., has been affected. But however, I also wanted to articulate is that isn't it a problem with an ideology of ability in which we largely live? And it is also talking about lockdown, the pandemic narrative, and our response to it is largely through a construction of how a social space, a normative social space. And that is where we need to disrupt. The normative articulation of a social space where we don't see existence of other identities, whether it is marginal when we talk about sex workers or we talk about people living with different kind of care is needed. So then we need to come back to these questions of mutuality and how do we then reimagine a public healthcare model which is based on that. How do we reimagine an ethical articulation of public care model? I think I will stop here, and I think there are a lot of thoughts coming at the same time. We need to probably unpack it one by one as we go along.
I understand, because these are all very topics that are very current, and also we have all been thinking about these questions. But I will just kind of ask a question for based on the discussion so far. Anybody can actually try and to respond to it. So there was this mention of a paternalistic state as perhaps an ideal by Dr. Dilip Menon. I mean, he had contextualized it in a detailed manner. So he said that the state should actually care, should take responsibility for the people. In fact, you've actually come up with perhaps an alternative perspective with this feminist care ethics. I mean, I don't know if I've got it right, but you may be actually talking in different kind of worldviews or contexts or something like that. Perhaps it's a different approach of seeing the state. But now you can respond to that. But there's another question. I'm going to play the devil's advocate here slightly. So when you have a welfare state, very caring, very socialist, I mean, very caring about all kinds of people, everybody in the margins and so on, is the state failing, or do we have other models? Like you mentioned, Dr. Bindu mentioned, there could be other models. So when I play the devil's advocate, I would ask this question: perhaps capitalists do it in a very good way. Perhaps capitalists, because of their planning and because of the corporate structures, because of their experts and like this technology and all that, they might actually be able to do things in a much better way than a state that is has got several delays and has different kinds of bureaucratic issues, red tape, all kinds of things. So would actually capitalists be good at solving some of these problems?
I'm happy to plunge in where angels fear to tread. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So as an empiricist, let me give an actual example of the capitalist response to the pandemic. And let me give it as the one that's currently very much in the news, namely development of vaccines. Not simply development of vaccines, but development and deployment of vaccines. We are all talking as though the development of vaccines is an innovative scientific tour de force. It is not. We know how to make vaccines in a very empirical trial and error sense, which is why we need the trials. The fact of the matter is, across the world, in 170 odd research groups that are trying to make vaccines, the coupling is very clear. And the coupling is, the research group is publicly funded, but its connection to eventual actual manufacture and distribution of vaccines is through private sector industry. This is across the world. Now, the question becomes, what is the model that this clear example of a capitalist intervention in the response to the pandemic tell us about the efficiency of the response? And the answer is, we've got nations of the global north placing advance priority orders en bloc with the transnational companies that are controlling the manufacture and therefore the distribution of presumed vaccines, not even real ones. This is exactly like repackaging debt and selling it as financial instruments. And yet what we are seeing is that, for example, the government of the United States of America has placed advance orders, hedging its bets for 3 times the number of vaccine doses as its population. We are in a competitive vaccine nationalism that is driven by the profit-making imperatives of the capitalist response to the pandemic. So to argue in the face of this that a capitalist response would be perhaps a more efficient one, I don't think stands the simple acid test.
Okay, good. Thank you.
If I may add something, I mean, I think what Dr. Rath has said also clarifies the basic problem in the way the question is posed or the opposition is posed between the welfare state and the capitalist model, that the capitalist model does not have a state role. Whereas we know from the history of capitalism that it has primarily been a state-backed enterprise.
Absolutely.
You know, so it's incredible how that simple opposition continues to inform public discourse, completely blinding us to the many complex discourses on political economy and economics that are going on, and that work gets sidelined because it does not fit this binary model.
Okay. All right. Are you done, Dr. Feroz? Yeah. So Dr. Devika has a response. I mean, she has an answer to some of these questions. So can you please speak up, Dr. Devika? Can you please unmute and speak up? I mean, she has a problem with the audio. So she has a problem with the video, but you know, we can hear you very well. So please speak up.
I can start the video also.
Sorry?
Now, okay, but I wanted to highlight the fact that much of the better work regarding the pandemic definitely was done by neither the big state nor capital. Now, Kerala did well, and even now, though the number of cases are growing in Kerala is still doing better than most parts of India, and I dare say even the world. And that is why, because you have something called decentralization here. So the state here looks a little different from other parts of the world, and definitely capital is not playing any serious role, except by way of some charity, some contributions in terms of philanthropic contributions, etc. But otherwise, you have a decentralized system. And it's not just Kerala. Take, say, for example, parts of Orissa, where local self-government has been able to mobilize. For example, in every ward, they have mobilized local corner shops and local auto rickshaws. So in some ways, managing to provide for a local area, keeping local business alive and providing employment to local. So in a sense, keeping economic life alive there, not taking over economic life, but keeping what you could call a small capitalism alive, allowing it to thrive, while actually kicking out the big businesses. So you're not seeing it happening because we are so very fond of the market. The big shops, in fact, in Trivandrum, for example, the super spreaders were the big supermarkets. These supermarkets were shut down for like 2 weeks and then allowed to function again. Government really, what we could have done with the kind of decentralized governance that we have is to keep alive a local market, keep the local shops open, mobilize local auto rickshaw people to deliver to services and groceries to homes, etc. This could have been done. Auto rickshaws could have been used to ferry, people feeling unwell to hospitals and back. this could have been done. But we did not do that because we are so, we are so terrified that if you shut down the supermarkets, for example, you shut down the large shopping areas, etc. Not the malls have been open partially, but whatever. See that the economy will collapse, and it will, because in some ways because the government is so heavily dependent on the bigger segments of the market. The government does not want to, obviously. Now, what I'm saying is, this is a time where if the state does not do it, civil society should be rethinking this entire frame of our life, the economic frame of our life. Of course, we don't have to get out of capitalism. We have to get out of globalized big capital. That's, I think, the long and short of what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank
Jobin,
you.
can I just
sure,
respond?
yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
So, in fact, no, this question which you posed, the state and capitalism, which I found very amusing because, as also Feroz has talked about it, and Professor Satyajit also informed us. And what Devika is also talking about, the specific context of Kerala, I was thinking this collapse of these two distinct categories happened long back in the healthcare system, because it is no longer state is distinct from the capital, because earlier we used to say that state is withdrawn from the service provision, and our angst about the privatization has come in. But right now, with their the context of the aggressive masculine nationalist ideology, we would see that capitalism flourish. So this is a very interesting way in which capitalism and the ideology of the nativism and the ideology of the state operates in a very, very particular way. So this has come to think of it, and this also talks to us how do we then respond to that, because number of ways in which state is trying to see citizens who can, in this collapse of capitalism and the state, where we see that we cannot distinguish them, it also comes in front of us with a number of choices. It is as if the individuals, the citizens can choose. So we have been, and even in the COVID pandemic, it has come to us. In front of us, it has come in terms of we have choices. Care ethics has taken a back seat in the whole process. And you would see that who can choose? The way in which it has been projected in front of us, there are choices in front of us. You can choose, and then service professionals can come home. There is home deliveries happening. There are different kinds in which there are arrangements has been done. So this idea of choice has been projected. We would also see that care, again, I want to carefully articulate care here. It is not, how do we then look at some of those, in the end of the day, we would also think about what is state's responsibility to begin with. And so how do we articulate the care? That has taken a complete backseat when we articulate this collapse of state and capital.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's a good answer to that, and also to connect to that question about marginalized bodies or marginalized individuals. Perhaps this a picture of efficiency might find it hard to deal with these marginalized bodies and so on, right? Perhaps that's one problem that is very pertinent in this context. That actually takes me to one question which I could pose to Dr. Feroz. I mean, you could take it. So the thing is, how about the, the horror, there's something about since you are a person who's working on representations, so this a contagious disease is also something that is horrific, right? Something that produces horror. So do you actually see, something like a representation of a sick body or a body which is not quite a normal, well-functioning? I mean, is there a notion of horror associated with that? How do you respond to it as a film studies expert?
Yes, I was actually thinking about that when Dr. Bindu Lakshmi was speaking earlier, for the earlier round of questions, that these contagion narratives actually, contagion is as much a metaphor in public discourse as it is something that designates a literal phenomenon. And contagion narratives are predicated often on this notion of a morally diseased body politic. And this morally diseased body politic is then identified using long-standing tropes around various identities, be that gender or specific communities, and so on and so forth. Okay? To give you an example from the best known films, Contagion, Steven Soderbergh's film, Gwyneth Paltrow's character is the one who is seen as carrying the virus across borders. Okay? But we also have another aspect to her narrative, which is that on her way back home, she spent a night with her ex-boyfriend. And that is something that we don't know. There's no explicit connection between that and the spread of the virus. But there is a clear attempt over here to sort of use a moralizing trope of adultery as something that not only compromises the individual but compromises the whole body politic. And it's a very, of course, it's a gendered notion. And because if you look at Outbreak, the other film, over there, the body politic is compromised by men, but their mode of compromise is seen as abuse of power rather than the vulnerable sexual identity of a woman, which of course was also used in talking about the AIDS epidemic. Okay. So minority sexualities become the place from which the community gets compromised. And then that is then used to build upon the reverse dynamic, which is that you call upon state intervention in order to repair the community in some ways.
Okay.
And, one last thing, that this metaphor also extends to media itself. Media as something that can compromise the body politic. Media contagion. Okay, and therefore the sort of reverse movement of that, which is that state takes control of media and therefore channelizes it in the correct ways.
Okay. Okay, I see that. You actually have led to a point which I wanted to ask, which is basically the histories of inequalities, right? So it's not just the case that inequalities exist in society and the media, including cinema, portray it. In a sense, the cinema and media are actually they carry these inequalities, right? In a sense, they disseminate notions of these inequalities. I mean, do you have any response to that, or am I asking for too much? I mean, am I actually stretching it too far?
Could you just
No. My question is basically just that. I'm sorry if I confused you. So the point is, the media also might be a perpetuator of inequalities in a sense, right? So the notions that are conveyed, the prejudices, biases, all those things. So would you please respond?
Yeah, I mean, media as a carrier of ideology is something that is mobilized by a sort of a moralizing discourse. And that is what I was pointing to towards the end of my last response. So I think I could say more about that with other examples, but I think that would sort of make it a too elaborate a response at this point.
Good. We can actually, maybe later we can have a longer, conversation about that. So there's a question. I mean, I think we will slowly move towards the questions. I'm not sure if you have many questions, but at least I'll take up one question that has come up. That is from Kaveri. And the question is not the number of women affected by COVID less than the number of men now? Any of you can respond to that?
Well, let me say this empirically. If it depends on your level of reductionism. If you say the number of women infected and seriously ill versus the number of men infected and seriously ill, as they are counted in hospitals, I'm being very specifically reductionist here, the answer is yes. What the underpinnings of this phenomenon are is entirely unclear. Are we undercounting women? We very commonly undercount women's distress in all sorts of situations. It would be completely unsurprising if we were doing that here. Are we undercounting women is a very straightforward question of context. But even more, when we say that we are counting victim numbers of a pandemic, are we counting victim numbers categorized by those who are victims by direct infection versus those who are victims by, let me say, indirect infection, in the sense people who are not infected with the virus in their bodies, but suffer consequences of the pandemic and of the societal and state response to the pandemic? My guess is that the answers will come out to be quite different. So I'm a little less, even though it is my community that puts out these numbers, I'm profoundly unimpressed by the small differences that we hear about. I would much rather unpack this as a far more complex phenomenon.
Okay, thank you for that. And
Jobin, can I?
Yeah, sure. Please
add
respond.
Something what Professor Rath is talking about.
Please respond.
Also, probably I will straight away move away from reductionism to address that question, because to come to think of it, the effect of COVID-19, what Professor Rath is talking about, which way you are trying to look at this question. If you're looking at a reductionist model, then there is one set of answer to that. However, we know that the disproportionate effect of COVID-19 across gender spectrum, that is what we are talking about. And I'm not even bothered about then this men and women distinction. I'm talking about across gender spectrum, across intersectionally. How do you talk about? That's where I want to take one important articulation here. Even this articulation of healthcare worker as one single category become extremely problematic. Then we talk about doctors and nurses as frontline warriors of pandemic. Where are we trying to bring in sanitation workers? Where are we trying to bring in the inequality deeply embedded in caste structure? So the problem here is that much deeper level when we talk about effect of COVID-19, and it is not only the articulation of whether women, of course, women suffer, and women suffer in multiple ways, and we have to articulate this question: which women are we talking about? How do we talk about intimate relationship? Are we talking about intimate relationship in a democratic way? Have we democratized our family? Have we talked about how it affects varieties of people? And even come to think of it, now the COVID pandemic is, we are probably living with this, what its after effects are. There are distinctions about, middle class home talking about, this anxiety about they don't have domestic workers to work with, and that is a genuine concern for many women working, and often the household work has been burdened into particular gender constitution. And but at the same time, there are also, we are hearing these scary stories about residential association is trying to make this mark about all domestic workers should come in with this COVID-19 certificate they have to go through. So where are we trying to, whom are we trying to articulate, consider as the carrier of the virus? How do we think about? So the effect what Kavya is articulating requires much more intersectional understanding to look at, particularly thinking about histories of inequalities in our country.
Thank you, Dr. Bindulakshmi. That's a detailed answer to that. And I'm sorry we didn't have much time to explore the question of intersectionality here. So there's another question from Renu. And the question is this. Do you think that the colonial attitudes prevalent in governance during the pandemic in India have to do with the tacit agreement we as a public have made to being ruled in an authoritarian manner? In fact, from the moment we surrendered the space for dissent / debate / resistances in India, haven't we willingly submitted to a hegemonic rule as it is seen now? Haven't we, in some sense, become our own agents of colonialism? Any responses to that?
Can I speak?
Sure, yeah, please.
Now, I would say that, see, this is a long-term problem. This is not something that happened now. So it's not that we have surrendered. I don't think this, I don't think we have surrendered so easily, if we have surrendered at all. But the resistance is still on. We all know that. I think this is a longer systemic problem that goes back into the Nehruvian times. I mean, look at public health. I doubt if public health in India has ever been decolonized at all, despite the early documents that talk about, expanding public health and making it more. The culture of public health in India, I do believe, still remains very strongly colonial. Like, for example, even in a region like Kerala, which celebrates its legacy of public health, a lot of it remains utterly colonial. Now, wherever, for example, also remember that the history of municipal governance in India is deeply tied to the fear of epidemics and epidemic management in a colonial style, which involves a lot of completely undemocratic the procedures. So, if you remember the histories of plague in Bombay, and in fact, it was the plague in Bombay that led to this, whole interest in municipality governance all over India, setting up of sanitation committees and all that. Now, have we really? We talk about the Panchayati Raj in the 1990s. The Panchayati Raj was established in different parts of India to different degrees. In some places, really very well. In some places, not. In Kerala, there was this really serious effort to pull it off its colonial roots. But how far have we succeeded? Even in Kerala, where there is a lot of talk about the success of Panchayati Raj, if you go, the coastal areas were the problem areas. Now, in fact, coastal areas in Kerala are seriously threatened by COVID. And those are also areas where decentralized governance was the weakest. And what was the response to the state to this weakness? By bringing back the colonial style of managing an epidemic. There was a flag march, an army flag march in areas affected, coastal areas affected by COVID. This is precisely how the British tried to handle the plague epidemic in Bombay in the 1890s. So, this is a problem of not just the middle class deciding to submit to the current dispensation and therefore allowing colonialism to take over. The point is that it has always been there, and now, given the fact that nationalism has completely abandoned any pretense of, economic nationalism, that is, it is completely, it's also, abandoned recently any pretense of welfare for the masses. All aspects of the developmentalist post-colonial state are being progressively dismantled. That is what is bringing this into view. It's intensifying it, no doubt, but also bringing it more and more into our view. That's what my response to Rinu's question.
Okay, so thank you so much. And actually, we are running out of time, so we have to conclude now. It was great having you, having all of you here, Dr. Satyajit Rath, Dr. Bindu Lakshmi, Dr. Devika, and Dr. Feroz Hassan. Thank you so much for your contributions, your interesting comments and responses to the questions. And perhaps we can continue this conversation in some other ways later. So thank you so much. Thank you again. And thank you to the audience also. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jobin.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jobin. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Devika. Thank you, Dr. Feroz.
I'm leaving now.
Yeah, good. We can just leave. Yeah, so that's fine.
Thanks, Dr. Jobin. So we'll be taking a short break. So we'll join back at 11:10. So we'll have a poetry reading by the renowned poet, Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Hello, is Ms. Arundhati Subramaniam here?
Yes, I'm
Yes.
sorry. Am I audible?
Yes, you're very audible. You're very clear. I think I was a little late, so maybe 1 minute. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. And so we have a 40-minute session with with the poet Arundhati Subramaniam. So we will have some questions and some comments. So first of all, welcome everybody to the to the conversation and poetry reading session. So so she basically the poet has agreed to talk about about language, creative use of language, poetry, and its relevance. Poetry as an art form, and a variety of things. So you also have are free to ask questions. Please post your questions on the chat box. So we are going to spend some 10 to 15 minutes with the questions. So first, I will start this conversation. So I am a little hesitant to ask this. So why why do you think so the thing with poetry is seen this very as a very desirable skill to have, like it's wonderful to be a poet and so on. But on the other hand, poets are also seen as this slightly not very mature kind of people, maybe very emotional, and it's something that you do as an adolescent and all that. So but then many people want to work on this craft, right? And they read a lot, try to write regularly and so on. So how do you actually take how do you actually respond to this, because you trained yourself as a poet, right? So what's your experience with this?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think in popular perception, poetry is very much an adolescent activity. And there's a kind of implicit hierarchy of forms that one picks up quite early, I think almost osmotically from a cultural environment, which ranks poetry as the adolescent form and prose as the adult one. And I think one picks this up quite quickly. And that might account for the fact that almost everyone has written a love poem, at least by the age of 16. And oddly enough, no one continues to be a love poet by the age of 19 or 20 if they want to take writing seriously. They've almost always moved towards fiction, or perhaps non-fiction, prose. But the idea is really that poetry is something you leave behind as soon as possible. And I think there are many reasons for that, really. One is, of course, the fact that, well, you don't see very many royalty checks if you're a poet. Publishers are few and far between, readers, buyers, none of them really materialize very often. And there's also the fact, as I often like to say, there's also the fact that there's an American survey that claims that poets die sooner than other species of writers. So many factors militating against being a poet. And I must say, I spent a lot of my life, particularly in my 20s and 30s, gnashing my teeth about the invisibility of poets and so on. But at this point, I'm almost convinced that it may not be a bad thing. The reason being that I think those who actually remain with poetry are probably doing it at least for the right reasons, because they love the form. Certainly not because it's going to catapult them into the spotlight in any way. I think that makes a difference. And whenever I do poetry workshops, and in fact, even though we're not doing a workshop now, the idea of just talking to students appeals to me, because this particular question for me is something I've always wanted to ask students to reflect on. Why is it that so many young people write poetry, but don't read it? When was the last time that, I've often asked this question, and there's usually a silence when I ask it when it's at workshops. When was the last time you actually bought a book of poems? Not one that was prescribed in some, nothing that's part of your syllabus and curriculum, but something that you just wanted to pick up and read. When was the last time that happened? And most often, people read poetry online, whatever they can pick up for free, but they're not going to spend money on a poem, on a book of poems. So I think all of that suggests to us in many ways that poetry is one of those forms that, oddly enough, everyone practices, but no one really continues to become a rasika or connoisseur of, you know, or a passionate reader of. But I think it's changing. I think it's changing. And that might have something to do with the fact that literary festivals routinely now have poets, because there's something about the spoken word that is alive. And that comes alive in a way that prose very seldom does. And there's also, I think, you know, there's speaking, then, you know, spoken poetry and slam poetry, all of that has also come into its own. That's given rise to a particular niche. So things are not as apocalyptic as they once seemed to be. And as to why we actually do it, if that's the question, if that's also a question, it's not because it's a kind of self-flagellating exercise. I believe one does it because there is some very ancient sorcery that a deep part of the self responds to instinctively. If you look back on the earliest form as a child that all of us responded to, the earliest verbal form, it was poetry. We didn't need anyone to teach us to love nursery rhymes or bits of doggerel or nonsense verse. We didn't need anyone to tell us that this was good. We responded to it effortlessly because it seemed to be kinetic language, you know, language pattern full of sound and velocity and excitement. So I believe that those very instinctive reasons why we gravitate towards poetry, towards the sensuality of language, towards a highly distilled compound of meaning and music and pause. I think all those reasons are actually why everyone can respond to poetry. Not everyone has a vocal response to poetry. Not everyone can explain a poem. And part of the problem is I think we've often been asked to explain poems and decode poems and paraphrase poems. But everyone can respond to a poem.
Yes. Thank you. That's a very, very good detailed answer to that. Now, as a teacher, I have wondered, can poetry be used for language teaching, right? I mean, this is something that came to me when you were just mentioning, when you were discussing this, probably the performative aspect, how the human mind is sort of instinctively responds to poetry and so on. So, and this question of meaning, the fact that meaning or, what is a poem about, when we try to explain a poem, all those things can be troubling in many ways. But poetry can actually appeal. I mean, when I just think of an example of one poem I sometimes use for teaching word classes, okay? And this is a nonsense poem, right? So it's Lewis Carroll's, I think it's Through a Looking Glass, to the Jabberwocky, the poem titled Jabberwocky, right? Twas brillig and the slightly toasted gyre and gimble in the wave and so on. So this thing, so the way it attracts, I've noticed that students play with it. In the beginning, they're confused. They say that it's nonsense, it's not English, and so on. But then you slowly make them look at it, and then they start to see patterns. So what I'm saying is they respond to it instinctively, perhaps, but then they make use of it to understand, something like grammar, right, which is very mundane, right? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a playfulness as well that we need to reclaim for ourselves in our enjoyment of language. And I think poetry does that very often. It's an exuberant use of language, highly skilled and highly exuberant all at once. And I think that is something people respond to, everyone responds to. And I really do believe that we need to reclaim that ability and that sense of empowerment, because far too often, I believe, people have stayed away from poetry because they're actually afraid of it. There's actually a belief that somehow because I may not understand something right away, it either means that the poet is silly or it means I am. It's sometimes easier to conclude that the poet is and shut the book and put it away forever. But there is a kind of niggling suspicion that maybe there's something wrong with me because I haven't understood it. And I think somewhere along the way, we just stop reading it altogether. So I always like to quote that Randall Jaddle line. You know, he says that it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because they find it difficult. It's because they've stopped reading modern poetry that they find it difficult, you know?
Yeah,
so I think there's an insight there that that's really waiting to be recovered.
Yeah, I understand. I understand that point. So this another question is about the you know, sometimes it also seems to me that poets are also you know, learned in a sense, right? I mean, you actually work on a craft, you you know, work on your vocabulary, certain metrical patterns, and then so it's something that requires skill. Maybe it's a bit like musical training, you know, training yourself with a musical instrument. So perhaps that's one reason why, you know, many students or many people find it difficult to like take to it naturally. I don't know. What's your thought on that?
Yes, I actually think, though, it always strikes me that, you know, music is an art that requires a great deal of skill. Many of us are willing to admit that we are just bathroom singers, but we don't necessarily believe that we need to have a mic before us, and we don't necessarily believe we need to be belting it out to the world. But that doesn't stop us from enjoying music, you know? And I think if we approached poetry similarly, it wouldn't be a bad thing. I often think of poetry as dance, language that is that moves. And I also think of it as music, essentially, which is highly capable of great levels of abstraction, but at the same time is a form to which we can respond viscerally. I think somewhere along the way, because all of us wrote those love poems at 15, we also began to believe that as long as we feel deeply, it is sufficient. That is a sufficient condition for poetry. I'd say it's a very important condition. It's a precondition to feel deeply. But there is also another kind of magic involved. I'm not taking away the magic at all. You know, I don't think it needs to be a kind of bleak choice between inspiration and perspiration. The two can go together. You know, yes, you may have that original moment of a deep, strong impetus to put down something on paper. Let that happen. But there's also a need to craft, to tweak, to put it away, to go back to revise. And that process of revision is not without its own pleasure. I think far too often people are scared of craft because they think it will take away or detract from that original inspiration. What is often not realized is that the riyaz that you put in, as you do it for music or any kind of sadhana, can be its own reward. It's like being a carpenter and hanging around in a workshop, you know. The smell of wood shavings itself is part of the pleasure. You know, the smell of words, the smell of language, sitting around in a whole heap of word dust. That's part of the magic of poetry. So I'd say we don't need to polarize creativity and craft. The two go together integrally. If we started seeing it that way, I think there's a way out.
Okay, so thank you so much. That's a great detail. So I just want to, in fact, I just realized that I didn't speak much about your contributions and so on. And in fact, actually, it was already given to the audience. So you are, Arundhati Subramaniam is a highly acclaimed poet with several fellowships and, you know, well-known works and so on. So When God is a Traveler was one of those important works that she produced. And then she also worked on a translation of Bhakti poetry. It's called Eating God, right? So there are many important works there, but I just want you to actually get to some of your poems, and also just to remind you that, you know, this conference basically is on contagion narratives, right? Basically the current COVID crisis that we are all going through. and then that deeply talks about, you know, how we understand human bodies, how we understand others, and, you know, questions of aging, questions of disease, and so on. So it would be great if you can actually talk about it and also share, you know, read with some of your works with us.
I'd be happy to read a couple of poems, but before that, I just want to say that what's interesting to me is how many people seem to have turned to poetry during this time. At least I seem to get many responses from people who seem to be instinctively gravitating towards poetry. And I think it has to do with the fact that poetry offers us a certain kind of a way, a strategy to deal with uncertainty. And these are times of such heightened uncertainty that I think there's a deep wisdom, a deep intelligence in us that knows that we need to head to a poem at this time. And one is the fact that it doesn't offer us certainties. That's not the way in which poetry offers us consolation. It often can offer us disquiet as well, you know, provocation as well. But what it does offer is access to the truth of this moment. This moment, it is not offering us some kind of doctrinaire conclusion. It is offering us this moment in all its confusion, all its brokenness perhaps, but it also offers us this wisdom, which is if you look at something, even if it is broken, even if it is fractured, even if it is deeply flawed, deeply uncertain, if you look at it long enough, hard enough, attentively enough, if you inhabit it deeply enough, profoundly enough, something is transfigured. And you have a glimpse of something that is perhaps whole. You know, I think that's the essential magic of the lyric poem in all its avatars in any part of the world. It's the reason why just yesterday I found myself turning to Blake again, you know, just to be reminded of this power of the lyric poem, to embody the deep truth of this moment, not to offer you the truth of the next moment, because we don't know what you're going to need next and what I will be next. This moment, which is so full of possibility. So for me, those very well-known lines from Blake are the ones I turned to yesterday. You know, the one from Auguries of Innocence about to see a world in a grain of sand,
Yes.
and heaven in a wildflower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. You know,
Beautiful.
those possibilities, those explosive, transformative possibilities of a moment. I'm actually tempted, since you've asked me to read, I'm actually tempted to read a poem that I wrote quite recently. And in fact, as recently as a month or two ago, so in the middle of the pandemic. It's not the poem that I planned to read to you today, but I'm tempted simply because we're talking about it. Let me just get it for you in a moment. Okay, so this is a poem called The News. Learn something new every day, say the wise ones. And so we try. The news today is that there's no one at the Champs-Élysées, no one at the gateway of India, no one at all in the spice market of Istanbul, the souk at Aleppo, that the great theaters and pulsating green rooms of the world lie plunged in darkness, that pigeons hover like suspended confetti over the piazza of San Marco, that no one's ordering double macchiatos in East Village cafes, that a woman walking back to her village from Telangana died of starvation in a Chhattisgarh forest. Her news, and it isn't particularly new, is that we are always 11 miles away from home.
It's very, yeah, very clear, very sharp images we read about, you know, these days. So this power of the moment, you know, that you mentioned, that kind of struck me strongly, you know. So so what we are clear about is this moment. I mean, is it a coincidence that you wrote the book of Buddha also, right? Many years ago. So in a sense, that's also a key idea of that line of thinking, right? The way in which, I mean, that's what we have, you know, it's all fleeting, and it's everything is in a state of flux and so on. So kind of that idea, perhaps, you know, and the performative possibilities and the thoughts associated with that. I mean, I'm trying to actually put towards something which probably I should not. Yeah.
No, you should. I think you should, in fact, because it's always interesting to me that the connection between, you know, when we were talking of the lyric poem, the connection between that and so much sacred literature or mystical literature from all over the world. The mystic poem very seldom, in fact, almost never, is about doctrinal certainty. And in the finest bhakti poems, you know, the Eating God, the book that you mentioned, is an anthology of bhakti literature. And what drew me to it is not in any way any kind of theological position, because that's not the point at which, that's not what draws me to this poetry. What draws me to it is that at its finest, these are not poets who are interested in any kind of doctrinal nicety. They are in fact drawing on deep subjective experience. And when they do, they in fact lead us to the power of this moment in all its possibilities. So it's what I guess has been called the still point in a turning world. We are right now inhabiting the pause like never before. And I think we turn to poetry at this time because, in fact, a poem, by definition almost, is an invitation to the pause. It's not just an invitation to meaning. It's not just an invitation to rhythm and sound and sensuality, though that is hugely important. It is also about all those blank spaces on a page. It is also about the pause between words. And I don't think there's any form other than poetry, any verbal art that embraces the pause as comprehensively.
Yeah, so I particularly like that, you know, the tone that doesn't require you to be extremely respectful of, you know, divinity and so on, where you can be friendly with God, where you can actually be friends and you can actually, you know, swear at them or something, you know. So basically various, the openness, you know, a kind of democracy of divinity, if you may put it that, if one may put it that way. And so, you know, it would be great if you can actually share one of those poems, because I remember, I mean, I had actually looked up a few, but I particularly remember something about the, you know, the contagion of this attitude, you know, towards divinity, right? Contagion. It's an infectious kind of a thing. So,
well, you know, the contagion it's really, contagion is the right word. It's an interesting word to be using today when we're all running around in masks. But, you know, it is interesting that somewhere between the 6th and the 8th century, in this very country, in Tamil Nadu, we seem to have seen this great effervescence and this great contagion, a wild, passionate longing for something more. You could call that something more Shiva or Vishnu, that's irrelevant. But the point is, there was this great, impassioned, feral, sometimes erotic longing for something more, for something beyond. And you have Appar, who's a poet I've loved, who has one of his poems, who in one of his poems says, you know, who needs to wake up at the crack of dawn and perform a whole lot of yogic feats and, you know, have a bath and all these kinds of ritual niceties? Who needs to do that? If you can, none of all of this, he says, is in vain if you cannot call him my friend. I believe it is this relationship of intimacy with the divine that cannot be contained. That's the contagion that seems to have spread from south to west to north to east. In a matter of centuries, the entire subcontinent in some way knows this fever. And you're absolutely right. The irreverence is contagious as well. So the poem I would like to share with you is by the 12th century Marathi, 13th century Marathi woman poet called Janabai. Janabai is a maid servant. That's what she does. That's what she did for her living. So when she's very tired, she asks her God to come and wash her hair. When she's even more tired, she asks God to come and do the dishes. And in this particular poem, which is my favorite, she speaks of the body and the beyond, the way many of these magnificent Bhakti poets do, with the kind of seamlessness. There is no apology for the body. And there is no bowing and scraping relationship with the beyond. So this is what she says. This is a translation by the well-known modern poet, Arun Kolatkar. She says, I eat God. I drink God. I sleep on God. I buy God. I count God. I deal with God. God is here. God is there. Void is not devoid of God. God is within. God is without. And what's more, there's God to spare. That sense of surplus, of extravagance, I think that spirit of abundance is something we could do with right now.
That's excellent. That's that's the spirit, and that's the equality sort of ingrained in it. I mean, which is an essential part of it is really striking. I'll just come to a question, right? I mean, there's some comments from audience. So there is a comment from Kaveri, and that goes like, in fact, to reflect later on and find the expression of word embodying the correct shade of meaning, and sometimes which resonate in unexpected ways, is really thrilling. It's a great way of putting it, what you have just expressed, the solitary figure of the woman projected against the expanse of no one and nothingness. So that's the point. And of course, you say it's great.
Seeing that evocative comment, response.
Yeah, it's an evocative response to that. And then Soma has this response, in the moment, the present, as unconnected to past or future. The idea resonated also from yesterday's presentation by Dilip Menon. Could you, I mean, basically this is for you, please elaborate on the point. So yesterday we had a historian, to put in perspective, historian Dilip Menon, who spoke to us. So he spoke about the critical juncture we are in, right, in the present moment and so on. So that's, so do you actually see any connections that way?
Well, since I haven't been present at his talk, I don't know if I can see a connection between his talk and what I'm saying now. Yeah. But I think particularly this, I will say, that I believe in a world that is, I often feel we live in a world that offers us only binaries. And that is somewhere deeply insulting, not just to our intelligence, but also to the wisdom of the heart, which I see as a very deep wisdom. The wisdom of the heart is always uncomfortable with polarizing the world into binaries. And the kinds of options we are left with today seem to be often dogmatism or jingoism. And between the two, we often feel that there are no options. You know, it's either kind of terminal earnestness or terminal escapism. And I believe that poetry is radical enough to offer us a third way. It offers us a third way between this language of frozen certitude, which is the language of dogmatism and fundamentalism, and the language of, there's either the slogan or the smiley. Between the slogan and the smiley, poetry offers a much more fluid, exploratory, searching way to navigate our lives. I think we need that today, because I'm sure this is something I hear from people again and again, that the strategy that seems to work today to make ourselves joyful doesn't seem to work tomorrow. And that's because we cannot apply any formula right now. Nothing is working. We have to keep generating an equipoise each day. And that's the journey we are being called upon to do right now. The world may be in a state of pause, but we have to actually find that poise. I think that's the reason we're also challenged.
Yes. That's right. So I'm actually reminded of when you mentioned this this polarization, like the tendency to see things in dichotomy or something, right? So there's science and poetry. I think there's a poem by Walt Whitman about looking up at the night sky, right? So there's this a poet who is sitting in an astronomy class, probably in 19th century US, and then the professor is describing things in the sky, right? Basically in space, right? Basically showing the stars and the planets and so on, and looking at the mathematics, the angles, and how do you calculate the size and distance and so on. And this particular poet is in the class, and he actually feels very disturbed or something, and he walks out of it, and then he looks at the sky outside, and he feels, he experiences that, and he thinks that that was a much more personally enriching experience than what he had experienced in the classroom. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I see his point, but I also see that he's actually reinforcing that dichotomy, right? In a sense.
And and that's fine for the poem, but I think today what we need to be seeing is that these are not at war with each other. Science and poetry certainly aren't. Even what we talked of earlier, passion, which is an integral part of poetry, and precision, they are not at war with each other. Creativity and craft are not at war with each other. Excitement and exactitude are not at war with each other. Why? Because, as I said earlier, we see again and again that the two go together. There's magic and wonder in both. These are not mutually exclusive at all. I think what we need to do, and this is irrespective of what kind of classroom we're in, whether we're in a poetry classroom of poetry or a classroom of science or astronomy or whatever else, whatever the discipline, what we need to, I think, recover collectively is a sense of wonder. Everything is not a puzzle. Everything is not a riddle. Some things are deeply mysterious. And that sense of wonder, if one approaches much of life with that sense of wonder, I think we'd actually find that there's a great deal of natural curiosity that we all have, which is inexhaustible. Inexhaustible. And it also produces a great deal of gratitude, which helps.
Okay, so that's great. And I'm also looking for more comments and questions. So yeah, there are comments, which are basically appreciative naturally. And then, we have a large number of students with us, PhD students, master's students, faculty members. And many of us are actually, going through these difficult times. Our universities are shut down. We have online classes, and in some cases, at least, there is a, that wonder seems to, take a back seat or something. So, as a poet, how would you respond to that? Or do you have any readings, any poems to share in that regard?
Well, I must say that, it's a daily challenge to renew that sense of wonder. And I sometimes feel quite bleak about it myself. So here's a one-line poem that I wrote 3 days ago, which is called, this is in a not very positive moment and not a moment of wonder, I should warn you. It's called Zoom's Day. And it goes, a world full of windows, but no sign of a door. Which is really the sense that I think many of us have in Zoom webinars, that we're endlessly doing, all of us reduced, completely leveled out into these little windows, disembodied, and having in some way to connect with each other this way. But there are also possibilities here, aren't there? Because I feel it's also allowed for a certain kind of conversation that we may not have had otherwise. You know, it's allowed for intimacy, and it's allowed for long exploratory conversations that I'm grateful for. I'm not sure I can offer you a positive poem if you're looking for wonder, but let me offer you this particular poem that I wrote recently. Though I was actually tempted to read you one from, let me read from my most recent book, okay? Not the poem I wrote recently, but this is a poem about a monk. And I'm choosing to read a poem about a monk because it strikes me that even while you and I are having this conversation, somewhere in the world, there is this monk whose life has been on a self-imposed pause for a very long time. The monk. And it, for me, offers possible sightlines, a possible flashlight into other ways in which life is being lived at this very moment. And it's a chosen life. The monk. The monk who's been in silence 16 years writes me a note at a yak tea stall, skirted by ragged prayer flags in a grey, hiccuping wind on the road to Kailash. His face is scar and fissure and gleaming teeth. He spends each day cleaning his shrine. It's worth it, he laughs. I clean the shrine, it cleans me. He was a spare parts dealer in a time he barely remembers, before he was tripped up by something that felt like a granite mountain in reverse, the deepest pothole he's ever known. Too deep to be called love. That turned him into a spare part himself, utterly dispensable, wildly unemployed. And if there is another lifetime, he says, this is what I'd asked for. And now he doesn't laugh. Same silence, same cleaning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very nice. So Rohini K. Poti had already requested you to read a poem, so you have already done it. And then Kaveri, has this message for everyone. The wonderful thing is art and poetry is the confluence of the contradictions of life. I think. Yeah. So basically, that is.
Yes. Well, those are. I've just started reading your.
Yes, I can hear you.
Gone away, huh?
I can hear you. I think there may have been a network issue, but I'm fine.
Network issue. And I know that we're reaching the end of your of our time, isn't it?
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. So thank you so much, Arundhati, for joining us and also talking to us. Sorry for the slight delay, and it didn't go in the typical way where I would introduce the person and then we go on to things. It started with the conversation. So, but we actually got to
I actually feel that there was a certain flow to this conversation, and that doesn't happen too often. So I'm glad for that flow. I'm glad for the spontaneity of it. I'm glad for the freewheeling quality of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, all the viewers, for all the participants. Thank you so much. So we conclude the session.
Enjoy that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ms. Arundhati. So from 12 noon, we'll have paper presentation sessions in 4 slots that will run parallelly. And so we have sent the embedded joining links to everyone by email. So we are looking forward to interesting paper presentations with a lot of audience interaction. Thank you. And we'll be back on Zoom at 4 p.m. for a plenary session number 4 by Dr. Andrew Fenton. Thank you.